In the chaotic symphony of a city that never sleeps, some silences are louder than others. For Donovan Reese, a man who commanded boardrooms and built a tech empire from scratch, the loudest silence was the one that lived in his own home, in the heart of his 6-year-old son, Matteo. He believed money could solve any problem, build any bridge, and fix any broken thing. But he was wrong. He was about to discover that the one person who held the key to his son's locked world wasn't a world-renowned specialist or a high-priced therapist, but a waitress named Zoe Sullivan, working for tips in a greasy spoon diner, a woman with a past as quiet and profound as his son's silence. This isn't just a story about wealth and poverty. It's about the currency of kindness and a language that speaks not to the ears, but to the soul. The clatter of ceramic on linoleum was a familiar, if grating, soundtrack to Zoe Sullivan's life. The Morning Dove Diner, with its cracked red vinyl booths and the perpetual scent of stale coffee and sizzling bacon, was a cage and a sanctuary all at once. It paid the rent on her tiny apartment and kept the collection agencies from calling quite so often, but each plate she carried, each fake smile she offered, felt like another shovelful of dirt on the grave of her dreams. She moved with an efficiency born of desperation, her dark ponytail swishing behind her. Her eyes, a deep shade of storm cloud grey, missed nothing, the salt shaker that needed refilling, the twitch of a customer's hand, indicating they were ready for the check, the quiet loneliness of the man in the corner booth. He'd been coming in for 3 weeks, always at the same time, 10:04 a.m., after the breakfast rush had crested, but before the lunch crowd began to trickle in. He was impeccably dressed in custom-tailored suits that cost more than her car, with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite, and eyes that held the weary weight of the world. With him was a small boy, his son, with a mop of sandy blonde hair, and eyes that were miniature versions of his father's, though his held a different kind of burden, a deep, unnerving stillness. The man was Donovan Reese. Zoe didn't know his name, not yet, but she recognized the aura of power that clung to him like expensive cologne. He was the kind of man who didn't wait in lines, the kind whose phone calls could make or break fortunes. Yet here in the humble Morning Dove Diner, he was just a father, and a failing one at that. He would order for them both pancakes with a side of fruit, for the boy black coffee for himself. He would then try with a painful stilted awkwardness to engage his son. He'd point things out the window, talk about his day in simplistic terms, show him things on his phone. The boy Matteo never responded. He never spoke a word, never made a sound. He simply existed in a bubble of impenetrable silence, his gaze fixed on the worn-out toy dinosaur he clutched in his hand. Zoe knew that silence. It echoed a void in her own heart, a space once filled by the laughter and frustration of her younger brother Daniel. Daniel had been born deaf, and the world of sign language had become Zoe's second native tongue. It was a language of grace, of expression, of life. It was the language she had used to tell him stories, to argue with him, to tell him she loved him, right up until the day an aggressive form of meningitis had stolen him from her and her family 6 years ago. The medical bills had shattered her family's finances and her parents' spirits, forcing Zoe to drop out of her program for special education and pick up an apron. The dream of helping children like Daniel was now just a faded photograph on her nightstand. On this particular Tuesday, the diner was unusually quiet. Donovan Reese looked more tense than ever, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the table. Matteo sat opposite him, lost in his world. Suddenly the boy's hand slipped, and the green plastic T-Rex tumbled to the floor, skittering under the table. Matteo's face crumpled. His eyes widened in panic, his chest heaving with silent, desperate breaths. He didn't cry out, he just vibrated with distress. Donovan knelt down, fumbling under the table. "It's okay, Matteo. Dad's got it. See, it's right here." He retrieved the toy and placed it back on the table. But the spell was broken. Matteo wouldn't touch it. He stared at his hands, his knuckles white, his body trembling. Zoe watched from across the room, her heart aching with a familiar pang. She saw not just a distressed child, but a boy who felt completely, utterly misunderstood. Acting on an instinct she hadn't felt in years, she walked over to the table. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. Donovan looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and exhaustion. "Yes, we don't need anything." Zoe ignored him, her attention focused entirely on Matteo. She knelt down so she was at his eye level. The boy flinched, pulling further into himself. Slowly, deliberately, Zoe raised her hands. She tapped her chin with her index finger, then moved her hand away in an arc, the sign for sad. She then pointed to Matteo and tilted her head, her expression gentle and questioning. "Are you sad?" Matteo's trembling stilled. His wide, frightened eyes blinked, then focused on her hands with an intensity that startled her. Zoe then pointed to the dinosaur. She made the sign for her friend, linking her 2 index fingers. She then mimed the dinosaur, falling her fingers, fluttering towards the floor, followed by the sign for scared. She pointed to the dinosaur again. "Your friend fell. Was he scared?" A flicker of something, understanding recognition, passed across Matteo's face. He looked from her hands to the toy, then back to her hands. His own small, trembling hand lifted from the table. Hesitantly, he copied her, tapping his chin. "Sad." Tears pricked at Zoe's eyes, but she smiled a genuine, radiant smile. She nodded encouragingly. She then signed, "My name is Zoe. It's nice to meet you." Across the table, Donovan Reese sat, frozen, his coffee, forgotten his multi-billion-dollar corporation, a distant thought. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the country's top child psychologists, behavioral therapists, and speech pathologists. They had all come to the same conclusion: selective mutism, trauma-induced, with no clear path to recovery. They had tried everything: play therapy, art therapy, even equine therapy. None of them had broken through the wall of silence. And now a waitress in a cheap diner with flour on her jeans and a name tag that was slightly askew had just had a more meaningful conversation with his son than he'd had in 2 years. Matteo reached out and touched the dinosaur. He then looked at Zoe and signed again, his movements clumsy but clear. "Friend." Donovan's voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse, thick with an emotion he couldn't name. How did you do that?" Zoe stood up, her professional waitress demeanor snapping back into place, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "It's just sign language, sir. American Sign Language." "I know what it is," Donovan said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Where did you learn it?" He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as a part of the diner's scenery, but as a person. "My younger brother was deaf," Zoe said quietly, the old wound aching. "I grew up with it." Donovan stared from her to his son, who was now holding his dinosaur, and watching Zoe with an unwavering, curious gaze. The gears in his powerful analytical mind were turning, processing this new, impossible variable. He saw a problem, and for the first time in a long time, he saw a potential solution. It wasn't in a sterile clinic or an expensive specialist's office. It was standing right in front of him, holding a coffee pot. He pulled out his wallet, but instead of cash, he extracted a sleek black business card. He stood up, his height and presence suddenly seeming to shrink the small diner. "My name is Donovan Reese," he said, his voice now imbued with the authority he was accustomed to. I don't know what your situation is, Miss Sullivan. Zoe Sullivan. Miss Sullivan. He continued, his eyes locking onto hers. I will pay you double whatever you make here. Triple. Name your price. I want you to work for me. I want you to talk to my son. The proposition hung in the air, smelling more of desperation than opportunity. To Zoe it felt less like a job offer and more like a transaction, a desperate father trying to buy a miracle just as he would buy a new car or a piece of software. Her pride bristled, but then she looked down at Matteo. The boy was looking at her, a silent plea in his eyes that transcended language, a plea she hadn't seen since she'd looked into the eyes of her own brother. And in that moment, her life and Donovan Reese's was about to change in ways neither of them could ever have predicted. The address Donovan Reese had given her led to a place that didn't seem to belong in the real world. It was a monolithic structure of glass and steel perched on a hill overlooking the city, a fortress of modern architecture that screamed wealth and isolation. Zoe's beat-up 2008 Honda Civic felt sacrilegious as it chugged up the pristine, heated driveway. A severe-looking woman with a tight grey bun and a sterner expression who introduced herself as Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, greeted her at the door. She looked Zoe up and down, her gaze lingering on the worn strap of her shoulder bag, and her disapproval was palpable. Mr. Reese and Matteo are in the playroom. This way, she said, her voice as starched as her uniform. Zoe followed her through a cavernous foyer with a ceiling so high it could have housed a flock of birds. The walls were adorned with abstract art that looked angry and expensive. The air was cool and still smelling faintly of lemon polish and nothing else. It wasn't a home. It was a museum exhibit on the theme of success. The playroom was the most sterile child space Zoe had ever seen. Everything was educational, ergonomic, and impeccably organized in clear plastic bins with printed labels. There were no messy drawings taped to the walls, no stray Lego bricks underfoot. It was a room designed by adults who had read books about child development, but had forgotten the joy of play. Donovan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, talking quietly into his phone. No, Mitchell, that's unacceptable. The offer from Pierce is predatory. We counter hard. I don't care what it takes. Matteo was on the floor, surrounded by a set of perfectly symmetrical wooden blocks. But he wasn't building anything. He was just lining them up, end to end, in a perfectly straight line. Donovan ended his call and turned his face, a mask of controlled stress. Miss Sullivan, thank you for coming. Zoe, please, she said, forcing a small smile. Zoe, he conceded. As we discussed, your role here is straightforward. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Your salary will be substantial. Your focus is Matteo. Engage him. Communicate with him. I want a report at the end of each day on any progress. He was treating it like a business acquisition, she thought. He'd identified a problem, a silent son, and hired a contractor, Zoe, to fix it. There was no warmth, no mention of Matteo's happiness or well-being, only progress. Mr. Reese? Zoe began, her voice steady, despite her nerves. Matteo isn't a broken toy. You can't just fix him. He needs to feel safe. He needs to build trust. That doesn't happen on a schedule or for a daily report. Donovan's jaw tightened. I am aware of that. I have a team of the world's best child psychologists on retainer. You are here for one reason: you have a skill they do not. Please just do what I hired you for. He turned and left the room, leaving the scent of his ambition and frustration in his wake. Zoe let out a slow breath and turned her attention to the small boy on the floor. She didn't try to talk to him. Instead, she sat on the floor a few feet away and pulled a worn, dog-eared paperback from her bag. It was her old ASL dictionary, the cover soft from a decade of use. She opened it and began to slowly, for her own benefit, practice some signs. She signed tree, then bird, then fly. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Matteo's block arranging slow. His head was still down, but his eyes were slanted towards her. She continued signing the word for dinosaur, then mimicking a roar with a fierce but funny face. She followed it with friend. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound came from Matteo. It was a soft huff of air, the ghost of a laugh. Zoe's heart leapt. She looked at him directly and smiled, then signed, "Do you want to teach me the names of your friends?" She pointed to the T-Rex he held. Matteo hesitated. He looked at the door where his father had disappeared, then back at Zoe. He picked up another dinosaur, a Stegosaurus, and pushed it towards her. Then he looked at her expectantly. And so it began. Their days fell into a quiet rhythm. Zoe quickly realized the expensive educational toys held no interest for Matteo, so she improvised. They made forts out of sofa cushions and bedsheets from the linen closet, much to Mrs. Albright's horror. They baked cookies in the cavernous, unused kitchen, filling the sterile air with the scent of chocolate and vanilla. Zoe got flour on her nose, and Matteo, for the first time, smeared a bit of dough on his own cheek in imitation, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Through it all she signed. She narrated everything they did, from mixing the dough, push-stir mix, to building their fort up over Hyde. She taught him signs for colors, for feelings for the animals in the picture books she brought from her own apartment. Matteo was a sponge. He soaked it all in his small hands, quickly becoming more and more articulate. He started signing back first with single words, then with simple phrases. More cookie. Zoe, look. Blue car. Waitress. Donovan would observe them from a distance, often from a doorway, or through the internal security cameras he monitored from his office. He saw his son doing things he hadn't done since before his wife Lena had passed away. He saw him smile, he saw him engage, he saw him happy. But the progress was a double-edged sword. It brought him immense relief, but also a sharp, painful guilt. Why couldn't he do this? Why was it so easy for this stranger to reach his son when his own father couldn't? One afternoon, a man arrived at the house. He was handsome and charming, with a smile that seemed permanently affixed to his face. He introduced himself to Zoe as Mitchell Shaw Donovan's oldest friend and the COO of his company, Reese Dynamics. "You must be the miracle worker I've been hearing about," Mitchell said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Donovan hasn't shut up about you. And this," he knelt down to Matteo, "must be the man of the hour." Matteo, who usually shied away from strangers, didn't retreat. Mitchell had a practiced ease with the boy, ruffling his hair and treating him like any other kid. "Donovan is wrapped up in a conference call from hell," Mitchell explained to Zoe. "Hostile takeover attempt from our favorite corporate shark, Gideon Pierce. Nasty business. I came to grab some files for him. Don't let us interrupt you." But he did interrupt. He stayed for nearly an hour, watching Zoe and Matteo interact. His questions were casual friendly, but Zoe felt a strange analytical quality to them. "Where did you say you learned to sign?" he asked, leaning against a counter. "My brother," Zoe answered simply. "Fascinating. And what were you doing before the diner?" "You seem far too bright to be slinging hash." "I was in college, had to drop out," she said, not wanting to elaborate. "A shame." Mitchell mused, his eyes glinting. "Well, Donovan certainly hit the jackpot with you. A diamond in the rough." The compliment felt slick, insincere. When he finally left, Zoe felt an odd sense of unease, as if her life had just been neatly catalogued and filed away. That evening, as Zoe was preparing to leave, Donovan stopped her in the foyer. "Report," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Excuse me. Your daily report. What progress did you make today?" Zoe's patience, worn thin by the sterile environment and her own financial worries, finally snapped. "Progress," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Today, Matteo learned the sign for laugh. He learned it because we made a mess with finger paints and he painted a blue mustache on my face. He didn't just learn a word, Mr. Reese, he experienced the feeling behind it. That's not something I can put in a memo for you. If you want to know what progress your son is making, maybe you should put down your phone step out of your office and make a blue mustache with him." She turned and walked out the door, her heart pounding. She was sure she'd be fired. She drove home the weight of her outburst and the impending loss of a job she desperately needed pressing down on her. But the next day, when she arrived trembling at the Reese mansion, she found something waiting for her in the playroom. On an easel there was a large sheet of paper. On it were 2 handprints, one large one small in blue paint, and next to them a note in Donovan Reese's sharp, angular handwriting. It said one word, "Sorry." It was the first crack in the billionaire's armor, and for Zoe, it was the first sign that she wasn't just an employee, but that she might just be a part of something that could heal this broken family. She had no idea that her presence in this house was about to threaten everything Donovan Reese had ever built, and that the charming Mitchell Shaw was not the friend he appeared to be. The blue handprints marked a subtle but significant shift in the household's cold atmosphere. Donovan began to emerge from his office. He wouldn't join in their activities, not at first, but he would stand in the doorway for a few moments, a silent observer. He replaced the command for a daily report with a hesitant question, "How was your day?" Zoe in turn began to gently push him. "Matteo learned the sign for build today," she'd say. "He built a tower that was almost as tall as he is. He was very proud." It was an invitation, a doorway she held open for him. One afternoon she found a beginner's ASL guide on the kitchen counter, its spine uncracked. She said nothing, but a quiet hope began to bloom in her chest. Matteo was blossoming. With Zoe as his voice, his personality began to emerge. He was funny with a mischievous streak. He was incredibly observant, noticing details that everyone else missed. He loved stories, especially the ones Zoe would invent, performing all the parts with her hands and face. For Matteo, Zoe was more than a caregiver. She was his bridge to the world. And for Zoe, Matteo was a balm on the old scarred wound left by her brother's absence. In teaching him, she was healing a part of herself. Their bond, however, was not universally celebrated. Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, viewed Zoe with thinly veiled suspicion, her lips pursed in a permanent state of disapproval at the disruption to the household's rigid order. More unsettling, however, was Mitchell Shaw. Mitchell was a frequent visitor, always arriving with a warm smile and a gift for Matteo. He was the perfect, cool uncle, and he and Donovan shared a bond forged in college dorm rooms and late-night coding sessions that had launched their company. He was family. Yet Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that his charm was a performance. His eyes, when he thought no one was looking, were cold and appraising. He would ask her probing questions about her past, her family, her financial situation, all under the guise of friendly conversation. "It must be tough," he said to her one day, as they watched Matteo and Donovan attempt to assemble a complex Lego set in the living room. Donovan was struggling his large hands, clumsy with the tiny bricks, while Matteo signed instructions with frustrated speed. "Losing your brother, your parents, losing everything. You've had a rough go of it, Zoe." "Everyone has their struggles," Zoe replied evasively, uncomfortable with his feigned sympathy. Of course, Mitchell said smoothly. But it's a testament to your character that you've landed on your feet like this. Donovan is a good man, but he's guarded. He trusts very few people. Me, and now it seems you. That's a powerful position to be in. The words felt less like a compliment and more like a warning. The pressure on Donovan from the hostile takeover attempt by Gideon Pierce and his firm Apex Consolidated was mounting. His phone calls became more frequent and more heated. He would pace his study late into the night, the blue light of his computer screens casting long, anxious shadows. They're anticipating our every move, Mitchell. Zoe overheard Donovan say one evening, his voice strained with disbelief. They were in his study, the door slightly ajar. It's like Pierce is sitting in on our board meetings. He knows our counteroffers before we even make them. There has to be a leak, an inside source. Don't get paranoid, Don, Mitchell's calming voice replied. Pierce is a shark. He's good at what he does. We're just under a lot of pressure. We'll find a way through this. We always do. But the leaks continued. A confidential algorithm developed by Reese Dynamics was mysteriously referenced in an Apex press release. A private acquisition target Donovan was pursuing was suddenly snatched up by Pierce for a fraction above Donovan's offer. The walls were closing in, and the stress was carving new lines onto Donovan's face. His suspicion, fanned by Mitchell's subtle insinuations, began to turn inward, poisoning the fragile trust that was growing in his home. You're on your phone a lot, he commented to Zoe one day, his tone accusatory. She had been texting her mother, coordinating a visit. I'm sorry, Zoe asked, taken aback. Who do you talk to outside of this house? He pressed. My family, my friends. Is that a problem? Just be careful, Zoe, he said, his eyes hard. Not everyone has your best interests at heart. The accusation, though vague, stung deeply. The implication was clear. She, the outsider, the girl from the diner, was a potential liability. The breaking point came a week later. Mitchell arrived at the house in a state of manufactured panic. Donovan, we have a major problem, he announced, striding into the living room where Zoe was reading to Matteo. The firewall for Project Chimera has been breached. From the inside, the access logs show a data transfer to an anonymous server just before dawn this morning. A server we've traced back to a network known to be used by Apex shell corporations. Donovan went pale. Project Chimera was his magnum opus, a next-generation cybersecurity protocol that was set to revolutionize the industry. A leak of that magnitude would not only cost him billions, it would destroy his company's reputation. Who? Donovan breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Mitchell sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at Zoe with an expression of deep regret. The breach was routed through a low-level access point, a guest Wi-Fi password, the same one you gave to your new nanny, Don. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Zoe stared at him, speechless. It was a lie, a monstrous, calculated lie. No, Zoe said, finding her voice. That's impossible. I'm sorry, Zoe, Mitchell said, his voice dripping with false pity. We ran a background check when you were hired, standard procedure. But we just did a deeper dive. A few months ago, you were drowning in debt. Medical bills, student loans. Then 2 weeks ago, an anonymous deposit of $50,000 was made into your bank account. Zoe's blood ran cold. The money was from her aunt, a small inheritance she had finally received after a lengthy probate battle over her grandmother's estate. It had been a lifeline, but in this context, it looked like a payoff. That was an inheritance, she stammered, her mind racing. From my grandmother. I have the paperwork, I can prove it. But Donovan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ruin of his life's work. The pieces so expertly arranged by Mitchell clicked into place in his mind, the girl from nowhere, with a desperate past, her sudden appearance, the impossible luck of his competitor. It was a classic corporate espionage play, and he had walked right into it. The trust he had tentatively placed in her shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. "Get out," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "Donovan, listen to me," Zoe pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "He's lying. I would never." "I said, get out of my house!" He roared, his face a mask of betrayal and rage. Matteo, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes, let out a choked sob and buried his face in the sofa cushions, his small body shaking. Zoe looked from the furious man she had just started to know to the heartbroken boy she had come to love, and then to the triumphant, sorrowful mask of Mitchell Shaw. She had been played. She was the perfect scapegoat, the disposable pawn in a much larger game. With her heart aching with a grief and injustice so profound it stole her breath, she turned and walked out of the gilded cage, leaving the whispers in the walls to fester into a full-blown catastrophe. The silence that descended upon the Reese mansion after Zoe's departure was a tangible, suffocating thing. It was heavier and more profound than the silence that had existed before her arrival. Before it had been an absence. Now it was a presence, a constant reminder of the laughter, the signing, the warmth that had briefly filled the sterile halls. Donovan threw himself into his work with a self-destructive fury. He worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and rage. He was a man besieged, fighting a war on two fronts. Publicly, he was battling Gideon Pierce's relentless corporate assault, which now, armed with the secrets of Project Chimera, was surgically dismantling his company's defenses. Privately, he was wrestling with the ghost of Zoe's betrayal, a wound that festered more painfully than any business loss. Mitchell Shaw was his constant shadow, the loyal lieutenant in the war room. He was a master of concern, his brow permanently furrowed with worry. "We'll get through this, Don," he'd say, clapping a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll rebuild. As for her, some people just can't be trusted. You have too big a heart. You saw a damsel in distress and wanted to save her." Every word was a carefully chosen dart, designed to reinforce Donovan's narrative of victimhood and Zoe's treachery. He expertly redirected Donovan's anger, channeling it away from any possibility of questioning the facts, and focusing it squarely on the waitress who had broken his trust. But the true casualty of the war was Matteo. The boy retreated so far into himself that he was almost unreachable. He stopped signing. He stopped playing. He spent his days sitting on the floor of his immaculate playroom, clutching his green T-Rex, his eyes vacant. The light Zoe had ignited in him was extinguished, leaving behind a profound and heartbreaking darkness. He refused to eat, pushing away the food Mrs. Albright brought him. He wouldn't look at his father. The fragile bridge between them had not just been burned, its foundations had been obliterated. Donovan tried to reconnect his guilt, a physical weight in his chest. He sat on the floor with Matteo, attempting the clumsy signs he'd learned from the book. "Son, talk. Please." Matteo would just turn away, his small back a wall of silent accusation. Donovan's frustration mounted, turning into a desperate, hollow ache. He had saved his company from the brink before had solved impossible equations and outmaneuvered the sharpest minds in the tech world. But he couldn't solve this. He couldn't solve his own son. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself wandering the silent house. He ended up in the playroom. The finger paints Zoe had brought were still on a shelf. He opened the jar of blue paint. The smell, chalky and childlike, filled the air. He remembered Zoe's parting words, her voice laced with a frustration that he now understood was righteous anger. Maybe you should make a blue mustache with him. The certainty of her guilt, which had been his only anchor in the storm, began to waver. He remembered the look in her eyes as he'd thrown her out, not the cunning of a corporate spy, but the raw, shattered shock of innocence. He remembered the genuine joy on her face when Matteo had signed "Love." Could that have been an act? Could anyone be that good an actor? He went to his study and for the first time decided to do his own digging. He pulled up the file on Zoe Sullivan that Mitchell's security team had compiled. He read about her brother Daniel. He read about her parents' subsequent bankruptcy after the onslaught of medical bills. He saw the documentation for the inheritance she had mentioned, the legal notices, the probate court filings. It was all there, a clear and legitimate paper trail that Mitchell had conveniently overlooked. The $50,000 deposit wasn't a payoff. It was a lifeline she had every right to. A cold dread washed over Donovan. He then pulled the logs for the firewall breach. Mitchell had told him it was traced to the guest Wi-Fi. But looking at the raw data, now Donovan, a master coder himself, saw something else. The breach was masked, yes, routed to look like it came from an external, low-level access point. But the initial command, the one that opened the back door, had originated from an executive-level IP address. An IP address inside the building. An IP address assigned to one of only 3 people in the company himself, the CTO and the COO, Mitchell Shaw. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. Mitchell? His friend since they were 19. The man who was the godfather to his son. The man who had stood by him at his wife's funeral. The pieces of the puzzle began to rearrange themselves with horrifying clarity. Mitchell's warnings about Zoe, his constant presence, his expert manipulation of the situation. It wasn't Gideon Pierce who was anticipating his every move. It was Mitchell feeding him the information from the inside. Donovan felt a profound, soul-crushing sickness. He had been betrayed on a scale he could barely comprehend, and in his blindness he had taken his own pain and rage and inflicted it on the 2 people who mattered most, his silent son, and the one person who had been able to give him a voice. He had destroyed his own family based on the word of the very man who was methodically tearing his life apart. The silence in the house was no longer just about Matteo. It was the sound of his own monumental catastrophic failure. He had accused an innocent woman, broken a little boy's heart, and handed the keys to his kingdom to a viper he called a friend, and he had no idea how to even begin to fix it. Zoe's world had shrunk back to the 4 walls of her cramped apartment. She'd tried to get her job back at the Morning Dove Diner, but her old boss, Stan, had already hired a replacement. She found part-time work at a bookstore, the quiet aisles, a welcome respite from her own tumultuous thoughts. But every child that came in every picture book she shelved was a painful reminder of Matteo. She was consumed by a righteous fury at the injustice of it all, but beneath the anger was a deep, gnawing worry for the little boy she'd left behind. She knew how fragile his progress had been, how much he depended on the stability and trust she had offered. To have that ripped away so violently, she could only imagine the damage it had done. One rainy afternoon, a courier delivered a small padded envelope to her apartment. There was no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of drawing paper. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. On one side was a large, angry red face with sharp teeth, Donovan, she assumed. On the other side was a small, crying boy. Between them was a figure with a wide, smiling mouth, but its eyes were 2 dark, empty circles. The smiling figure was handing a key to a creature that looked like a shark. Below the shark, Matteo had drawn a snake. Zoe stared at the drawing, her heart pounding. It was a story, a desperate, silent scream for help. The smiling man with the empty eyes had to be Mitchell. The shark that was easy, Mitchell had called Gideon Pierce a corporate shark. He was giving the key the secrets to Project Chimera to Pierce. And the snake, a snake in the grass. It was more than just a child's drawing. It was testimony. Matteo had seen something. He knew. Zoe's despair hardened into resolve. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It wasn't about the job or the money. It was about a little boy trapped in a house with a man his father thought was a friend, but who Matteo knew was a monster. She had to go back. Meanwhile, at the Reese mansion, Donovan was a man adrift. His discovery of Mitchell's betrayal had left him paralyzed. He had no one to trust. The company was hemorrhaging money and clients. The board was calling for his resignation. He was on the verge of losing everything. He tried to talk to Matteo to apologize. He sat with him holding the ASL book, his hands shaking as he formed the signs. Sorry. I was wrong. Matteo just stared at the wall, unresponsive. Donovan's phone buzzed. It was a notification for the final emergency board meeting, scheduled for the next day. Gideon Pierce would be there. It was a surrender meeting, essentially. Pierce would present his final, insultingly low offer, and the board panicked, and seeing no other option would accept. Reese Dynamics would be no more. Just as he was about to give in to his despair, the doorbell rang. He ignored it, but it rang again, more insistent this time. Annoyed, he strode to the door and pulled it open, ready to dismiss whoever was on the other side. It was Zoe. She looked different. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. She held the drawing in her hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Zoe, Donovan began, the apology dying on his lips. "I know. I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," she said, pushing past him into the foyer. "Your son is trying to tell you something, and you're not listening." She laid the drawing on the grand marble table. "This is Mitchell," she said, pointing to the smiling man. "This is your competitor Pierce, the shark. And this is a snake. Mitchell is the snake. He gave the key to your company to Pierce." Donovan stared at the drawing, a mirror of the conclusion he had come to himself. "I know," he said quietly. "I figured it out. I looked at the firewall logs, but I have no proof. It's my word against his. The IP address could have been spoofed. Mitchell has covered his tracks perfectly. The board meeting is tomorrow. It's over." "No," a small voice said. They both froze. The voice was raspy, unused. They turned. Matteo was standing at the top of the stairs. He had spoken. One word. No. He walked slowly down the stairs, his eyes fixed not on his father, but on Zoe. When he reached the bottom, he launched himself into her arms, burying his face in her coat, his small body shaking with pent-up emotion. Zoe held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. After a long moment, Matteo pulled back. He looked at his father, then at Zoe, and his hands began to move, flying with a speed and precision that astonished them both. He signed about a day he was supposed to be napping. He hadn't been able to sleep, so he'd gone to his father's study, a place he was normally not allowed. The door was open a crack. He'd peeked inside. Mitchell was there on the phone. He was speaking in a low voice, but Matteo saw his reflection in the dark screen of the main computer monitor. He saw Mitchell's fingers type a password into Donovan's private terminal, and Matteo, with his exceptional eye for detail and patterns, had memorized it. He began to sign the letters and numbers, his small fingers spelling out the password. ENLIGHT. SAFOREVER88, the name of his deceased wife. A password so personal, so sacred, Donovan had never shared it with anyone. A password Mitchell must have guessed or seen him type once. A password that would give him access to the deepest, most secure parts of the system, the transaction logs that couldn't be erased. Then Matteo signed something else. A name. Mr. Coburn. Donovan's blood ran cold. Jeremy Coburn was a junior programmer at Reese Dynamics. A brilliant but disgruntled employee, Mitchell had personally recommended firing 2 weeks ago for sub-par performance. He had been the perfect internal scapegoat, the person Mitchell had been setting up to take the fall for the breach all along. The logs would likely be manipulated to point to him. Mitchell isn't just a traitor. Donovan realized aloud, a new cold fury replacing his despair. He's going to destroy an innocent man's life to cover his tracks. Matteo then signed one last thing, a final chilling detail. He mimicked Mitchell on the phone, putting a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture as he looked out the study door. Then he pointed to himself and made the sign for nothing and broken. Mitchell had seen him. He had seen Matteo watching him, and he had dismissed him. He had looked at the silent little boy and seen a broken, useless thing. A non-entity who could see everything but say nothing. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated you, Zoe whispered to Matteo, her voice thick with pride. Donovan looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not a fragile, broken child, but a warrior, a silent guardian who had held the key to saving them all. The board meeting is at 9 a.m., Donovan said, his voice now steel. We don't have much time. The race was on. The mansion's heavy air of despair evaporated, replaced by the electric hum of frantic purpose. Donovan, with Zoe by his side and Matteo refusing to leave them, was a man reborn. The weary, defeated executive was gone, replaced by the laser-focused titan who had built an empire from scratch. The password Matteo saw, Lena Forever 8888, isn't just for my terminal. Donovan explained, his fingers flying across a keyboard, illuminating screens with cascading lines of code. It's the root key to the server's immutable audit trail. Mitchell used it to gain access, but he would have assumed the trail itself couldn't be altered. He doesn't know about the fail-safe I built into it. He typed in the password Matteo had signed. Access granted. I'm in. He breathed. Zoe, I need you to find the number for Jeremy Coburn. He's the programmer Mitchell fired. We need him now. As Zoe searched on a tablet, Donovan quickly laid out the treachery they were up against. Mitchell's plan is cruelly brilliant. He created a ghost program that mimicked Coburn's digital signature, making it look like the breach came from his workstation. He's planting a trail of digital breadcrumbs that will lead investigators straight to an innocent man. By the time they're done, Coburn will look undeniably guilty, and Mitchell will look like the hero who uncovered the traitor. That's monstrous, Zoe said, having found Coburn's contact information. Zoe made the call. Jeremy Coburn's voice was understandably bitter and suspicious. He listened to her urgent explanation with disbelief, convinced it was some cruel prank. Donovan took the phone, his own voice a sharp, commanding blade. Jeremy, this is Donovan Reese. I was wrong. I was manipulated by a man I trusted, and you were his scapegoat. I can't undo the damage he's done to your reputation yet, but I can give you the chance to clear your name and watch the man who did this to you go down in flames. After that, I'm offering you your job back with a promotion and a signing bonus that will make your head spin. Be at the Reese Dynamics Tower in 1 hour. Use the service entrance. My head of security, Peterson, will be waiting for you. He's one of the few who still answers to me, not Mitchell. He hung up, leaving no room for refusal. It was a gamble on a wronged man's desire for justice over his resentment. For the next hour, Donovan worked like a man possessed with Matteo, perched on the chair beside him. The boy was their compass in a sea of encrypted data. He would point at the screen when he recognized a symbol or a string of code he'd seen Mitchell type, his flawless memory guiding his father's search. Donovan unearthed the ghost program, isolated the original command from Mitchell's IP address, and found the time-stamped digital footprints that Mitchell thought he had erased. He packaged it all into a secure file, a digital bomb, ready to be detonated. As the first light of dawn streaked the sky, they raced to the Reese Dynamics tower. They met a nervous but determined Jeremy Coburn at the service entrance, where a stoic man named Peterson escorted them to a private elevator, bypassing the reporters already gathering in the lobby, like vultures sensing a corporate death. He led them to a small observation room, with a one-way mirror overlooking the main boardroom, slipping in just as the meeting was called to order. The atmosphere in the boardroom was grim. The board members looked defeated. Gideon Pierce sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, a wolf confident in his victory. And beside the empty chairman's seat, looking every bit the capable concerned successor, was Mitchell Shaw. Mitchell stood his face, a mask of sorrow. As you know, my team has worked tirelessly to identify the source of this catastrophic breach. With deep regret, I must inform you that we have found the traitor. The evidence is irrefutable and points to a disgruntled former programmer, Jeremy Coburn. He placed a data stick on the table. This contains everything. With this painful chapter closed, and with Donovan unable to lead, I am prepared to guide this company through the acquisition. It's time, Donovan whispered and signaled Peterson. Just as Mitchell was basking in his apparent victory, the boardroom doors swung open. Every head turned. Donovan Reese strode into the room, his presence instantly commanding silence. He was not the broken man they expected, but a figure of immense power and cold fury. Behind him walked Zoe, and at her side, holding her hand, was Matteo. Mitchell's confident smile faltered, replaced in a heartbeat by a look of practiced concern. Donovan, my God, we were so worried. What are you doing here? I'm here to save my company, Mitchell Donovan, said his voice, like ice. He walked to the head of the table, and to expose the real traitor. Don, you're not well, Mitchell said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. We've already found the man responsible. No, Donovan interrupted his voice, cutting through the tension. You presented a scapegoat. He nodded to the observation room door. It opened and Jeremy Coburn walked in. Mitchell went white. The data stick you provided contains a very convincing frame job, Donovan continued. But you made a mistake, Mitchell. You planted your evidence using my private credentials from your own office. He inserted his own data stick into the table's port, and the large screen at the end of the room flickered to life. A red line shot from Mitchell's executive IP address directly to the Project Chimera server, bypassing all the fake trails. Timestamps appeared. Then audio files of Mitchell's calls with Gideon Pierce began to play, his voice filling the horrified silence. Don't worry, Gideon. He suspects nothing. The board will be begging you to take over by Friday. The color drained from Mitchell's face. And how did I know where to look? Donovan's voice dropped, drawing every eye. How did I find the proof you thought you'd buried? He looked down at his son. You made one other mistake, Mitchell. You committed your treason in front of my son. You looked right at him, and you saw nothing. But he saw everything. Donovan nodded to Matteo. The boy, standing in the center of a silent boardroom, was not afraid. He looked directly at Mitchell Shaw, and with clear, deliberate movements, raised his small hands, First he made the sign for snake, then liar, and finally, with a firmness that sealed the man's fate, he signed bad man. The boardroom erupted. Mitchell stumbled backward, his mask shattered, revealing the panicked, greedy man beneath. Peterson stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his arm. It was over. In the wake of the climactic board meeting, justice was swift. Mitchell Shaw faced a battery of federal charges, and Reese Dynamics, far from ruin, rose from the ashes stronger than ever. But the most profound victory wasn't celebrated in a boardroom. It was felt in the quiet moments within the glass and steel mansion. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Matteo's occasional precious words and the constant fluid motion of his signs. The house, once a gilded cage, was finally a home. Donovan transformed was no longer just a provider, but a present father. He learned to leave his work at the office, dedicating his evenings to building Lego castles and becoming fluent in the language of his son's hands. Matteo, thriving in the newfound warmth and stability, began to heal his world no longer defined by a traumatic silence. A few weeks later, Donovan sat with Zoe, not to offer a paycheck, but a purpose. "Zoe, you saved my son, and you saved me." He began, his voice thick with sincerity. "I want to build something meaningful, something permanent." He outlined his vision for a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to helping children with communication disorders and their families. He wanted to name it the Lena and Daniel Foundation, honoring both his late wife and her brother. "A foundation is just money and a name without a heart." He continued, his gaze locking with hers. "It needs you. I want you to be its founding director. Finish your degree, I'll fund all of it, and build this from the ground up." Tears of disbelief and joy streamed down Zoe's face. The dream she thought was buried forever was being handed back to her, more vibrant than she had ever dared to imagine. Her quiet nod was all the answer he needed. Their lives found a new, beautiful rhythm, a partnership in healing others and raising Matteo. The lines between them blurred into a seamless bond of love and respect. One evening, as they watched Matteo chase fireflies in the twilight, Donovan reached over and took her hand. "This was just a structure before you came," he said softly. "You made it a home." Zoe looked at the man beside her and the laughing boy on the lawn. She had come to the mansion to give a child his voice, and in doing so had found her own purpose, her future, and finally her family. The story of Donovan, Zoe, and Matteo reminds us that our greatest strengths can often be born from our deepest wounds. Zoe's past grief gave her the language to heal a silent child, and in doing so, she healed herself and an entire family. Donovan's journey shows us that true wealth isn't measured in stock portfolios or corporate power, but in the connections we build and the humility to admit when we are wrong. It's a powerful testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound communication doesn't require a single spoken word. It's about seeing the person others overlook, listening to the silence, and having the courage to bridge the quiet gaps that separate us. If their story of hope, resilience, and the power of understanding moved you, please take a moment to click the like button below. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that miracles can be found in the most unexpected places. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Thank you for listening.